miserable old man, 3 ghostly visitors, one Christmas Eve that changes everything. You know the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, but what you don't know could chill your bones. A Christmas Carol wasn't born from Charles Dickens' imagination alone. It was ripped from the headlines of Victorian England, where real men hoarded fortunes while children starved in the streets just outside their doors. But here's what they never tell you. Scrooge was based on actual people, men so consumed by greed they lived like the needy, despite their vast wealth. One such miser was found, passed away, alone, surrounded by rotting food and piles of gold, too paranoid to spend a single penny, even on his own survival. And those ghostly visitors, they weren't just literary devices. Victorian England was obsessed with the supernatural. Seances were held nightly. The dead were believed to walk among the living. Dickens himself attended these ghostly gatherings, convinced that spirits could breach the veil between worlds. The most disturbing part, the story was written as a warning, one that went tragically unheeded. Tonight, we're digging up the reality that inspired literature's most famous ghost story, because sometimes the most terrifying tales are the ones rooted in truth. When Christmas enters our thoughts, we see twinkling lights cutting through winter darkness, families gathering around warm fires, and the simple magic of giving. But Charles Dickens had something far more sinister in mind when he penned A Christmas Carol in 1843. He gave us Ebenezer Scrooge, not just a character, but a warning, wrapped in flesh and bone. Scrooge wasn't merely wealthy, he was something far more dangerous. Dickens painted him as a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, each word carefully chosen to reveal a man who had become something less than human. This wasn't just greed, this was a complete severing from everything that makes life worth living. When we first encounter Scrooge, he's already cold inside. He's methodically cut every human connection from his life, family, friends, even the simple pleasure of a shared smile. Christmas, that universal symbol of hope and renewal, becomes his enemy. His famous cry of "Bah, humbug," isn't just dismissal, it's the battle cry of a soul that has chosen isolation over love, money over meaning. But here's what makes Scrooge truly terrifying. He wasn't born this way. Every cruel choice, every rejected kindness, every moment he chose profit over people, these decisions carved away pieces of his humanity until only this hollow shell remained. But the most chilling part, Ebenezer Scrooge wasn't born from Dickens's imagination alone. He was inspired by real men whose greed had become the stuff of nightmares. Meet John Elwes, a member of the British Parliament who inherited not one, but 2 massive fortunes. The first came when his father died, leaving 4-year-old John with wealth beyond measure. But here's where it gets twisted. His mother, Amy, left with £100,000, was so consumed by her own money-hungry obsession that she literally starved herself to death rather than spend a penny on food. Young Elwes watched his mother waste away, and the lesson stuck. By 1763, at age 49, Elwes inherited a second fortune from his uncle, now one of the wealthiest men in Britain. He chose to live like a beggar. He refused to light fires in winter, preferring to shiver in darkness rather than buy coal. His clothes were rags, his properties crumbling ruins that he refused to repair. Most disturbing of all, he ate food so rotten that mold covered every bite. There are accounts of him devouring a partridge that rats had already gnawed on, savoring every putrid morsel. Then there was James Jimmy Wood, the Gloucester miser. This banker hoarded wealth while living in squalor so extreme that after his death, people claimed his tortured spirit haunted his own bank. Both men had everything, yet chose nothing. Wealthy beyond imagination, but spiritually bankrupt. Dickens knew these stories. Everyone did. They were cautionary tales, whispered in parlors and printed in newspapers, real-life horrors that proved how wealth without compassion could turn a human being into something monstrous. During Charles Dickens's lifetime, Victorian England was drowning in an obsession with death. The Industrial Revolution hadn't just transformed society, it had shattered people's understanding of life itself. Massive changes brought massive anxiety, and with it came a desperate hunger to connect with something beyond the veil of mortality. By the mid-1800s, spiritualism had infected every level of society like a fever. The wealthy gathered in dimly lit parlors for seances, while the poor scraped together coins to consult mediums. Spirit photography promised to capture the faces of the dead, and across the nation, people convinced themselves they could speak with those who had crossed over. This wasn't just curiosity, it was desperation, an entire culture grappling with loss, change, and the terrifying question of what comes after. This supernatural obsession bleeds through every page of Dickens's A Christmas Carol. Those ghostly visitors aren't mere storytelling tricks. They're reflections of Victorian England's deepest fears and most desperate hopes about death, memory, and what waits for us on the other side. Jacob Marley arrives first, and his appearance is nothing short of nightmarish. Bound in heavy chains that clank with every movement, he tells Scrooge these shackles were forged in life, each link representing another act of greed, another moment of selfishness. The chains bear padlocks, ledgers, and cash boxes, physical reminders of a life consumed by wealth. His tormented state serves as a chilling preview of Scrooge's own fate. Marley's ghostly form perfectly captures Victorian beliefs about restless spirits, souls condemned to wander because of their earthly sins. In Victorian art and literature, ghosts carried the weight of their past mistakes, often literally bound by chains of guilt and regret. Dickens understood this imagery would resonate with his readers, who lived surrounded by stories of the supernatural and feared their own moral failings might follow them beyond the grave. But Marley represents something even more sinister. He embodies the cold, calculating business elite that Dickens despised. In Victorian England, wealthy industrialists often ignored the suffering of the poor, viewing human misery as simply the cost of profit. Through Marley's eternal punishment, Dickens delivered a warning: ignore the plight of others at your own peril, because some consequences follow you far beyond death. Here's what most people don't realize about Dickens. His childhood was marked by a darkness that would haunt his writing forever. When his father's debts finally caught up with the family, young Charles watched helplessly as his father was dragged away to Marshalsea debtor's prison. At just 12 years old, Dickens was forced to work in a rat-infested bootblacking factory, labeling bottles for 10 hours a day while his family rotted behind bars. This wasn't just hardship, it was abandonment. It was the brutal realization that money, or the lack of it, could destroy everything you held dear. And it's this trauma that breathes life into every ghost in A Christmas Carol. The ghost of Christmas past is Dickens' own tortured memory made manifest. This spirit appears as both child and ancient being, with a brilliant light blazing from its head, like a beacon cutting through darkness. That light, it represents something the Victorians understood all too well, the painful clarity that comes when you're forced to confront who you really are. But there's something unsettling about this ghost power. It doesn't just show Scrooge memories, it forces him to relive them, to feel every moment of joy that turned to ash, every choice that led him down a path of isolation. The Victorians believed the past was a living thing, always reaching forward to shape the present. And in Scrooge's case, that past is suffocating him. The ghost of Christmas Present carries an even more disturbing message. This spirit, draped in the robes of Father Christmas himself, represents everything Scrooge has rejected: generosity, community, human connection. But here's the twist. This ghost ages and dies before Scrooge's eyes, reminding us that the present moment is fleeting, that opportunities for redemption don't last forever. The ghost of Christmas, yet to come, emerges from the shadows like death itself, cloaked in darkness, silent as the grave. This spectre never speaks, never reveals his face. There's something deeply unsettling about this final visitor, and Dickens knew exactly what he was doing. This was the Grim Reaper himself, reimagined for Victorian London. When readers first encountered this hooded figure in 1843, they would have immediately recognized the ancient symbol of death that had haunted human imagination for centuries. The same dark robes, the same terrifying silence, the same inevitable purpose. But here's what makes it truly chilling. Dickens wasn't content to simply scare his readers. This ghost leads Scrooge to witness his own funeral. his own gravestone, his own forgotten legacy. In an era where death lurked around every corner, from cholera outbreaks to industrial accidents, Victorian audiences lived with mortality as their constant companion. They knew the Grim Reaper's face intimately. The ghost's deliberate silence becomes a weapon of psychological terror. No threats, no explanations, just the cold certainty of what awaits us all. Dickens understood that sometimes the most powerful message comes not from words, but from the deafening silence of inevitability. This spectre forces Scrooge and every reader to stare into the abyss of their own mortality and ask the question that haunts us all. What will remain when we're gone? Some literary scholars believe that Tiny Tim emerged from a much more personal darkness in Dickens's life. The character may have been partly inspired by his nephew, Henry Burnett Jr., a frail boy whose delicate health condition and physical challenges left a deep impression on the author. Dickens watched this innocent child struggle against forces beyond his control, and that image would haunt his writing. But the real horror that shaped Tiny Tim wasn't just one child suffering. It was the epidemic of neglect poisoning Victorian London. Thousands of children were slowly dying in the shadows, their small bodies wasting away from malnutrition and disease, while society turned its back. These weren't statistics to Dickens. They were faces he saw when he visited hospitals, voices he heard crying in the night. The author knew this darkness intimately. When Dickens was just 12 years old, his world collapsed as his father was dragged away to debtor's prison, and young Charles was forced to abandon his education to work in a boot-blacking factory. Day after day, he labored under brutal conditions, his childhood stolen by circumstances he couldn't control. That experience carved something deep into his soul, a raw understanding of what it meant to be powerless, forgotten, expendable. In Victorian England, diseases like tuberculosis and rickets stalked poor children like predators, and Tiny Tim's mysterious condition would have been all too familiar to readers who had watched their own loved ones fade away. Through this fragile character, Dickens wasn't just telling a story, he was holding up a mirror to a society that had learned to look away from its most vulnerable victims. Then there's Bob Cratchit, a mirror reflecting the harsh reality of countless Victorian families trapped in a system designed to break them. Working as a clerk in Scrooge's counting house, Bob endured the kind of exploitation that defined an entire era. Long, brutal hours in freezing conditions, for wages so meager they barely kept his family alive. But here's what makes Bob's story so haunting. He represents millions of real people who suffered under bosses exactly like Scrooge. Victorian England was built on the backs of workers who had no choice but to smile while being ground into dust by their employers. Bob's quiet dignity in the face of such cruelty wasn't just admirable, it was survival. Dickens didn't pull this character from thin air. He'd walked London streets, witnessed families choosing between food and warmth, seen children like Tiny Tim wasting away because medical care was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Bob Cratchit was every father desperately trying to provide for his family, while his employer counted profits in the next room, completely indifferent to human suffering. The most chilling part, Bob's kindness isn't just remarkable, it's revolutionary. In a world where showing weakness could mean losing the job that barely feeds your family, maintaining compassion becomes an act of quiet rebellion. Bob Cratchit proves that even when the system tries to crush your spirit, humanity can still flicker in the darkness. If Ebenezer Scrooge embodies pure greed, then Fezziwig represents something almost too good to be real. A boss who actually cares. He throws legendary parties, treats his workers like family, and shows us what happens when wealth is used to heal rather than harm. But here's the unsettling truth. Fezziwig might be more fantasy than reality. This jolly employer wasn't just Dickens being cheerful. He was holding up another mirror to Victorian society, showing them what they'd lost. While real factory owners worked children to death and paid starvation wages, Fezziwig danced with his employees and made sure no one spent Christmas alone. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. Some believe Fezziwig sprang from Dickens's own desperate childhood memories, a time when he worked in a boot-blacking factory, abandoned by his family, when his father was thrown into debtor's prison. Perhaps Fezziwig was the father figure young Charles never had, the employer who saw worth in a scared, forgotten child. But here's what makes Fezziwig truly haunting. He represents the family that broken people create for themselves. In an era when workers were treated as disposable machines, Fezziwig offered something revolutionary: belonging. He didn't just give his employees jobs, he gave them a place at the table when they had nowhere else to go. That kind of kindness, in Dickens's world, was almost supernatural in its rarity. A Christmas Carol emerged from the shadows of one of history's darkest social experiments. Victorian England had become a grotesque theatre where human suffering was not just ignored, but systematically orchestrated by those in power. The numbers tell a chilling story. While the wealthy dined on 7-course meals, nearly half of London's population lived in squalid, overcrowded slums, where entire families crammed into single rooms. Children as young as 5 worked 14-hour shifts in factories, their small fingers perfect for operating dangerous machinery. Debtors' prisons swallowed whole families. But here's what makes it truly disturbing. This wasn't accidental. Victorian society had convinced itself that poverty was a character flaw, that the starving masses deserved their fate. The wealthy looked down from their mansions and declared the poor lazy, immoral, unworthy of help. It was a convenient lie that let them sleep peacefully, while children froze in the streets below. Dickens saw through this facade. He watched friends and neighbors vanish into workhouses, institutions designed to be so miserable that death seemed preferable. He witnessed a society that had weaponized Christmas itself, turning a season of giving into another opportunity for the rich to showcase their superiority, while the poor begged for scraps. When Dickens penned A Christmas Carol, he was launching an attack on the very foundations of Victorian society. Every ghost that visits Scrooge represents a truth his readers desperately wanted to avoid, that their comfort came at the cost of others' suffering, and that their indifference made them complicit in a system of organized cruelty. Dickens understood something profound about human nature. We are all haunted by our choices, our regrets, and our unfulfilled potential. The ghosts that visit Scrooge aren't supernatural beings. They're the voices we've silenced within ourselves, the memories we've buried, the futures we fear to face. In the end, A Christmas Carol isn't just about Christmas or charity. It's about the possibility of transformation, even when we believe we're beyond redemption. It reminds us that no matter how deeply we've buried our humanity, it's never too late to dig it back up. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of one of literature's most enduring tales. If you've made it this far and enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps spread the word about the channel. And subscribe to be part of our growing community of buried tales. Which of the 3 spirits do you think would have the most profound impact on your own life? And what buried truths from your past, present, or future would you be most afraid to confront? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful revelations come from acknowledging what we'd rather keep hidden. Don't forget to join us next time when we'll uncover another story that has shaped our understanding of the human condition. And remember, the most transformative tales are always buried.